So when Alice invited me to come to Utah, I was like, wow. She said, well, you get to introduce Naomi at her keynote. And so I definitely said yes. And I was really happy to be invited to introduce her because basically when you get down to it, I'm like a poor man's Naomi Oreskes. In 2003, she published what was the very first research quantifying the level of scientific agreement on human-caused global warming. 9 years later, we published the follow-up study, essentially establishing the same result, which was really surprising for me because when we published ours, everyone was so surprised. I was like, really? This is okay. After Naomi published her consensus study in 2003, immediately what she experienced was a backlash, being attacked, being personally attacked, her research being attacked from a variety of sources, from people who rejected the science on climate change. And we experienced exactly the same thing in 2013. Our research being attacked by senators and congressmen, conservative media, conservative think tanks. It's a very familiar pattern. Now, one of the advantages of Naomi is she's a science historian. And so when all these attacks started coming towards her, she thought, there's an interesting science question here. And she started researching it. And that led to her publishing the Merchants of Doubt book, which went on to become a film. So I think the lesson there is, if you're a science denier, don't attack science historians. It doesn't end well. And similarly, my background, like my research, is cognitive science. So when we started getting attacked, that led me to researching the psychology of misinformation and denial. And I've been investigating that for the last decade. And basically what I found is the way to counter misinformation is to inoculate people by explaining the techniques used to mislead people. It took me a PhD and 10 years to find this out, and it turns out Naomi'd been doing that for the last 10 years anyway. That's what the whole Merchants of Doubt book is. So I guess my career path is kind of like Naomi's, but about 10 years later. I'm hoping to deliver the keynote address in 2027, I hope. So, and when they do make a film, if he can pull off the accent, I'm hoping Mark Ruffalo will play me. So. But anyway, I guess I'll finish by saying that I tend to follow the motto, what would Naomi do? Because it worked, right? And so I'm going to continue to shamelessly copy her until she sues me for plagiarising her life. And it's with that that I'm very proud and pleased to introduce Naomi Oreskes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, John, for that amazing introduction. And we all know plagiarism is the most sincere form of flattery. So anyone who wants to plagiarize me, go straight ahead. And actually, I have to say, John's work has been incredibly valuable and important to me because when I started working on this, I didn't really have any training in how to deal with disinformation or even like how to be a public figure, how to communicate about climate change. I really went with my instincts on a lot of these things. And so now John has used science to validate my instincts. So how great is that? You know? So thank you very much. And thank you all for being here today. It's really a pleasure to be in Utah, my second favorite state. Yes, the first is California. But so I know a lot of you here are skiers. Some of you are rock climbers and mountaineers. And you know that in rock climbing, the most important lesson is don't look down and don't flinch. So after the election, I got a lot of email from students and other people saying to me, well, now what? Now what do we do? And so I decided to make that the topic of a lecture. Although I thought now what sounded really depressing, so I changed it to what now. Seems a little bit more like the moment in rock climbing where you think, okay, what now? So, and this is on the sixth pitch of a six-pitch climb in Idlewild. At this point, there's no going back. And just a few more moves, and we're there, and we made it, and that was a good moment. So let's get started. One of the things that's difficult, and we've talked about this a lot today in the space, the climate change and sustainability space, is the challenge of walking a fine line between being realistic and honest about the situation we face and not being so depressing that everybody just goes home and turns on Netflix. So we have to be realistic about the situation we're in right now, and it's a grave one. Things are not looking particularly good. The scientific findings on climate change are very, very worrisome, and right now the state of our political situation is worrisome too. So what do we do? Well, I want to spend a few minutes today talking about the science, to just be really serious about where we're at, a little bit about the politics, a little bit about our work for Merchants of Doubt for people who aren't familiar with it, but then talk about where we can go from here and end on a positive note, because there is some really positive, there are positive things on the horizon. Many of you have heard about them today, but I want to think hard about what it's going to take to really move the positive, to move the needle on the positive side, and to do it in the time we need. Because one of the things we know about this, sorry, I'm getting weird messages. Let me turn off the internet here. We can fix this problem, but we don't have all the time in the world. And that, I think, if you remember one thing from my talk today, I hope that will be it. In communication, they say if you want people to remember, you have to say it 3 times. So here's the second one. We can fix this problem, but we do not have all the time in the world. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the bad news, and we'll get it out of the way. The temperature information is very, very bad. As many of you know, 2015 shattered global warming records. It was the hottest year on record by a lot, and 2016 was even worse. 2016 established the world record for the hottest year from start to finish. So sometimes we have a very hot summer, sometimes a very hot winter. 2016 was hot from start to finish. And as many of you know, 2017 now has also set a record. So the last 3 years have been among the 3 hottest on record. In short, the world just keeps getting hotter. There is no reprieve. Global warming has not paused. Now, of course, we shouldn't be surprised by this. As John pointed out, people keep being surprised by things that we already knew. And that keeps us in business, because then we get to be invited to keep talking about them. But honestly, like, I'm getting old now, and I would like to retire reasonably soon. I don't want to be here when you invite John back in 10 years' time. Okay, basic physics. This is Physics 101. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. If it continues to increase, we expect the temperature to continue to increase as well. And guess what? It has, it does, and it keeps getting worse. People talk a lot, you've all heard of 350.org. People have talked a lot about how CO2 in the atmosphere broke through that 400 barrier. But actually, if you look at CO2 equivalent, which is all the greenhouse gases, including methane, CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere now is 478 parts per million. So we're already way past that 350 level. Now, climate change is unevenly distributed, and often contrarians will use this to make mischief, find some little place in the world that's cooling. But actually, this is not good news. This is bad news. We often talk about the 2-degree threshold or limit for dangerous climate change. But in fact, many parts of the world have already passed that 2-degree level. So how many of you know what polar amplification is? Okay, a lot of people don't. So polar amplification is the phenomenon where climate change, global warming, happens faster in the poles because the ice and snow reflects sunlight back to Earth. So if that ice and snow starts melting, you get more absorption of solar heat, and so things heat up even more rapidly. Scientists predicted this in the 1970s, and it was already visible by the year 2005, so right around the time that I was first doing my consensus work. By 2005, major segments of the polar regions had already passed 2 degrees C of warming. Today, most of the North Polar region has already experienced 4 degrees of warming. This is way past that 2-degree level that's supposed to be the limits for dangerous interference. Climate change is also unequally distributed in summer and winter. Winter is now warming faster than summer, and for people who like snow, for people who depend on winter for economy, states like Utah, this is really serious. The winter warming in the United States since 1970 is already 2.8 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 1.5 degrees centigrade. So our winter warming here in the United States is already close to that 2-degree limit. Now, if you're here in Utah, if you care about snow, I'm on the board of Protect Our Winters. If you're a skier or a snowboarder and you're not a member of Protect Our Winters, you should join, shameless plug. There are nearly 52 million ski and snowboarding days in America every winter, and that supports about 191,000 jobs and $11.4 billion in value to the national economy. This is all at risk. So anyone living in a Rocky Mountain state, anyone who's involved in the ski industry or knows anyone who is, which is probably just about everybody in Utah, this is a really serious economic threat. Protect Our Winters just released a report that we've done a few times already in the past, and we've just updated it, where we look at the impact on the state economy in all the states that have winter sports in the good snow years compared to bad snow years. And I didn't have time to make a slide specifically for Utah, but if you look closely at this, you can see that bad ski years lead to a loss of $32 million in direct earnings here in the state of Utah, and a loss of $53 million in added value to the state economy. So that's real money. Let's talk about sea level rise. One of the things we've learned in the last few years is that scientists' estimates of sea level rise, their earlier estimates, are almost certainly too low. In the last IPCC report, two IPCC reports ago, AR4, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, predicted less than 1 meter of sea level rise by the year 2100. But in 2009, that work was updated by Vermeer and Rahmsdorf, who said a more realistic figure was probably more like 1 to 1.5 meters of sea level rise. In 2017, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, issued a new report saying that a realistic figure was something like 1 to 2.5 meters. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, let me just point out, we know that a lot of people want to dismiss all of this as just natural variability. We hear all the time climate contrarians say, oh, the weather is always changing. Well, this ain't natural variability. This is a plot that shows sea level rise going back to the 1st century, so going back to the time of Christ. And we can see that we have good scientific evidence that, yes, sea level is always changing, just like the weather is always changing, except look what happens in the 20th century. It's like nothing we have ever seen in the history of recorded human activity. Now, why does this matter? Well, if you go to the real estate site Zillow, so not Greenpeace, not 350.org, but the people who promote the buying and selling of real estate in the United States, they estimate that 1.9 million American homes are within 2 meters of current sea level, with a combined value of $880 billion. So imagine if 2 million American families lose their home, and where are these people going to go? And who's going to pay the cost of that loss? And it's not just Florida. Florida is on the front line of climate change, but it turns out almost 300 US cities would lose at least half their homes. Half their homes! And 36 US cities would be completely underwater. I call San Diego my home. It's where I raised my children. I still own a house there. A few years ago, during the financial crisis, a lot of people lost their homes due to the subprime mortgage crisis, and we talked about people being underwater financially. Well, according to Zillow, if we saw 2 meters of sea level rise, 2,289 homes would be literally underwater. In addition to that, huge amounts of expensive infrastructure, including hotels, airports, and roads along the beach, and most of the US Navy base in San Diego Harbor would be underwater. In fact, sea level will require most of the Earth's cities to re-engineer themselves during the 21st century. So this is just a picture of whole areas of New York City which will be underwater, literally, if we have 2 meters of sea level rise. Now, I recognize that I'm in Utah, and sea level rise might not feel like a big concern when you live in the Rocky Mountains or the middle of America. But bark beetles are, or they should be. As many of you know, due to more mild winters, bark beetles are now killing huge swaths of trees in western North America. This is a photograph that I took last year in South Dakota, where if you haven't been there, the damage is just breathtaking. I mean, it's unbelievable. You can drive for miles and miles and miles and see scenes like this. In South Dakota, the US Forest Service concludes that the beetle has invaded 430,000 acres since the epidemic started in 1996, which is about a quarter of the forested portions of the Black Hills. Here in Utah, there are hundreds of square miles where there's been more than 95% lodgepole pine kill. These are direct losses in terms of the value of the timber, in terms of the beauty and habitat, and huge increase in fire risk. It's one of the reasons we've been seeing worse wildfires in the American West. And of course, wildfires end up with huge costs to all taxpayers who have to foot the bill for the fire fighting efforts. In 2010, Utah Summit Councilman John Harrigan said, quote, "We're in deep water." So this is now becoming a metaphor for climate change in lots of ways. So this is something that people here know about, that's been written about in the paper. But sadly, many people still refuse to acknowledge the link to anthropogenic climate change or are being pressured not to acknowledge it. So in South Dakota, I found this on the website of the Black Hills National Forest. The forests of the Black Hill are changing, or they're not. William H. Illingworth, while on Custer's Black Hills expedition in 1874, photographed a more open-growing forest caused by fire and insects. Modern forest management, including careful use of fire, can recreate some of those conditions and ecological processes and restore healthier, more resilient forests for the long term. It takes a collaborative all hands approach, but it could be all lands approach to do it. While much work remains to be done, we are making a difference. Now, I believe in the power of positive thinking, but not when it comes at the expense of the truth. And here's what somebody here in Utah said. U.S. Forest Woman spokesperson said, "It's a cycle that all national forests go through. It's a matter of getting used to a different face of the forest." Well, the last part of that statement is true. We will be getting used to a different face of the forest because these changes are not going to be easily reversed. But it's not true that this is just a natural cycle. Like sea level rise, this is not natural variability. And forest ecologists have demonstrated this, that this epidemic has been caused or made much worse than it might otherwise have been by winter warming, that same winter warming I talked about at the start of my talk. It began in the 1990s because that is when winter temperatures in the Rocky Mountain states were no longer sufficiently cold to consistently kill the beetle larva. And this has been demonstrated scientifically. Another bad news story is the loss of Arctic sea ice. Many of you will have seen the news reports just this week saying that scientists have been stunned by the off-the-charts Arctic temperatures and record low sea ice. At the North Pole last week, the temperature was 35 degrees, which was about 70 degrees above normal for that part of the world. Now, climate contrarians often like to say that scientists and environmentalists have exaggerated the threat of climate change, but actually this finding and work that my students and my colleagues and I have done actually have demonstrated that scientists have not exaggerated the threat. In fact, they have underestimated it. In many areas, temperature change, sea ice lost, sea level rise, we are seeing changes happening faster than scientists predicted. Okay, so enough bad news on the science, let's have some bad news on the politics. To talk about this, I want to just step back for a minute and talk a little bit about our work in Merchants of Doubt. I know a lot of the students and faculty here on this campus have read the book or seen the film, but for those of you who hadn't, I thought I could just give you 2 clips from the film that tell you in a nutshell what we found in our work, and then talk a little bit about why this is so important even now. So the first clip is, we're going to introduce the basic storyline, which is to introduce the Merchants of Doubt, the people who cast doubt on the science about climate change, and try to answer the question, who are these people? Who are the Merchants of Doubt?
Bill O'Keefe is Executive Vice President of the American Petroleum Institute. He's also a board member of the Global Climate Coalition, made up of oil and electric companies, automakers, and others.
We believe it was the war on oil and the off-oil agenda. Climate change was part of that.
I think that it's unfortunate that the science is so distorted and misstated.
The science is complicated. There are lots of different factors, so you really have to understand the whole picture.
There is a natural variability that has nothing to do with it.
Climate is changing naturally.
It has to do with sunspots, it has to do with the wobble of the earth.
And so it's not too difficult to persuade some of the public that we really don't know for sure. So maybe let's wait a while. We need to have more proof.
We need more data. The science isn't there to make that determination.
there is no need for us to rush to this kind of judgment to respond.
Others put out ads saying more pollution is going to be good for us.
A doubling of the CO2 content of the atmosphere will produce a tremendous greening of planet Earth.
CO2 is a benefit to plant life. It's increasing the bounty and the productivity of the planet, our ability to feed populations in this world.
What you're seeing here from the coal industry is perfectly analogous to what the tobacco industry used to do. They refuse to change, refuse to shift, and they're trying to convince us that it's actually good for us. The way they used to say, luckies make you healthy.
So you get the picture. You know, I've had the opportunity to speak all over this country, and one great thing about it is the different things that people respond to. So I gave this talk last year in Cincinnati, and Don Blankenship, did anybody notice him? CEO of the Big Branch Mine, and he went to jail for criminal violations associated with mine safety at the Big Branch Mine. So when I gave this talk in Cincinnati, there was this audible gasp in the room, like, oh my God. So, you know, this tells you a little something about who these people are. Okay, so we get the picture. Executives of the coal industry, oil and gas, ExxonMobil, trying to create this impression that we don't really know, the science is unsettled, and it's natural variability. But one of the questions we wanted to answer in our work was, well, how does this work? I mean, it's kind of obvious that the CEO of ExxonMobil is not going to be very excited about accepting the reality of global warming caused by fossil fuels. But how do they persuade ordinary Americans to believe them and to disbelieve scientific evidence? So the next clip helps to answer that question.
They present themselves as scientific, and they even use graphics to make them look like the actual scientific reports that they're trying to discredit.
This is a report produced by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And here is a mirror of that, produced by the Cato Institute. They've adopted the exact same page layout design. If you were a congressman, how would you tell the difference between this and this one? And that's the point of this deception.
This is kind of an extended summary. It's called a synthesis report.
So
the actual IPCC report is about so thick.
And how thick is your NIPCC report?
Same.
It's
same.
You're as thick as they are?
We strictly use the same thickness.
So.
Okay, so unlike a lot of academics, I would like my work to be obsolete. I would like to be able to go back to doing obscure history of science, but unfortunately I haven't been able to because unfortunately the merchants of doubt are still at work. In fact, it's worse than that. The merchants of doubt have actually taken over the White House and a big part of the federal government. Now that might seem like a dramatic or exaggerated thing to say, but just consider a few facts. The head of the EPA transition team was a man named Myron E. Bell from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a longtime collaborator of the man you just saw there, longtime climate change denier, a person who has personally attacked me and my colleagues. Steve Malloy, who calls himself, without irony, the junk man, has been a longtime defender of the tobacco industry, also served on the EPA transition team. Scott Pruitt, as you all know, when he was the Attorney General of Oklahoma, filed suit against the Clean Power Plan. Now head the EPA, he has said repeatedly that we don't know the role of CO2 in changing the climate. And then there's Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, now Secretary of State. When Tillerson was nominated to be Secretary of State, many people I knew said, well, isn't this good? Because Tillerson doesn't deny the reality of climate change. Well, in having done the work I've done for the last 10 years, my motto is, watch what people do, not what they say. So I just want to show you one more clip that talks about what Tillerson was doing at ExxonMobil right before he went to serve President Trump. And his plans then and now remain very clear: to drill the world's largest remaining untapped oil reserves in the Russian Arctic.
Top US oil company ExxonMobil and Russia's Rosneft have signed a deal to develop oil and gas reserves in the Russian Arctic.
One of the reasons this deal is now possible
is because of the human-induced global warming that has rolled the ice back. It's warmer in the Arctic than it's been in at least 40,000 years. And yet there's ExxonMobil looking at that, thinking they can drill more. The very thing they paid groups to tell us wouldn't happen has now benefited.
So, and some of you know, if you've been following Tillerson at the State Department, one of the main things he's been working on the last year is to try to roll back the Russian sanctions, which are the only thing that is standing between us now and the development of those oil reserves. Now, why is this such a big deal? Why does this matter? Well, because development and combustion of those reserves will, without doubt, push global atmospheric greenhouse concentrations far above the dangerous climate disruption level. In fact, a recent scientific paper published in the prestigious journal Nature put it this way, quote, "Development of resources in the Arctic is incommensurate with efforts to limit average global warming to 2 degrees C." So though ExxonMobil and Rex Tillerson may say that they believe climate change is real, everything they're doing points in the direction of driving us further towards that dangerous anthropogenic interference. Now, we often talk about trying to talk about climate change in ways that are not political or trying to depoliticize the argument. And I understand that, and I certainly think it's really important to find opportunities to reach across the aisle to work with diverse shareholders or stakeholders on this issue. But I think it's also really important to understand how we got to where we are right now, because there has been a tremendous change in the politics of environmentalism since 1990. And if you look at this chart that was put together by the League of Conservation Voters, the Environmental Voting Score, one of the things you see that's very interesting is if we go back to 1970, the voting records of Republicans and Democrats in Congress on environmental issues were not actually very different. And in fact, if you go back even further to the 1950s, you'll find Republicans actually have a better environmental scorecard than Democrats did. And there was very strong bipartisan support for environmental legislation in this country in the 60s and early 70s through the Nixon administration. But that began to change quite markedly after 1990s, with Republicans turning almost entirely against environmentalism, so now they're like 90% anti-environmental, and conversely, Democrats becoming more strongly pro-environmental legislation, so most of them are around 80 to 90% in favor. So this is not to say that we have to perpetuate these partisan divides, but we do have to understand them. And this is where politics comes in, because we need to ask the question, why did Republicans stop supporting environmental protection when in fact they were as good or better than Democrats on this issue back in the 1960s? And what we showed in our work in Merchants of Doubt was that since the end of the Cold War, there's been an increasing commitment of American conservatives to the principles of laissez-faire capitalism, to the idea of letting markets flourish, decreasing government involvement, and decreasing regulation. Now, I want to say that often that's a good idea. I don't think anybody should be in favor of unnecessary regulation. But the question is, what do we do when markets fail? Because sometimes markets do fail. Sometimes a legal product, like tobacco or fossil fuels, hurts or kills people. And sometimes economic activity creates serious problems like climate change that markets don't seem to know how to fix. Economists have a name for this. They call it market failure. It's a well-known thing. It's not something that only just happened today. And market failures require some kind of extra market intervention, some kind of government or social or political response. Now, until recently, if you asked an economist what was the greatest market failure ever, they would probably tell you the Great Depression. Maybe the tulip bubble in Holland in the 17th century. But if you ask them now, they will tell you the answer is climate change. The Stern report, written by Lord Nicholas Stern, former chief economist of the World Bank, said that anthropogenic climate change is the greatest and widest-ranging market failure ever seen. They calculated the external cost of carbon to be in the trillions of dollars, and Lord Stern is now a major advocate for carbon pricing to remedy the market failure. But this helps to explain why denial is so prevalent among folks in the private sector or conservatives who are opposed to what they call big government. Because if you believe in the magic of the marketplace, then you're going to be reluctant to admit it when that magic fails. And then we add to this one more key piece, the claim that if the government intervenes, we'll lose our personal freedom. And this is a big part of the rhetoric of climate change denial, that this is somehow a conspiracy to take away our personal freedom. And this rhetoric was also used during the campaigns over tobacco control. So I just want to show you a tiny short clip from the film. This is the last clip. This is a Tea Party rally. The person at the front there is Tim Phillips, the head of the Tea Party. And I want you to hear how he greets his audience at a Tea Party rally.
Good afternoon, fellow freedom lovers!
Fellow freedom lovers, as we didn't all love freedom too, right? So this is a really important thing to understand, because if we're going to deal with this question, we have to make the point that we believe in freedom too, right? But we also have a serious problem that needs to be addressed. So what we learned in our work was that climate change denial is not about the facts. It's not about the facts of how much sea level has risen or the facts of how much sea ice has been lost. It's what sociologists call implicatory denial, rejecting facts because you don't like their implications. And it's not just conservatives that do this, liberals do it too. We're all subject to motivated reasoning. So it's like people you know, and I'm sure you do know some of these, people who reject the evidence that smoking is addictive, because if you're a smoker, that would mean admitting you're an addict. And that's not a very nice thing. Most of us don't like to think of ourselves as drug addicts. But it also has the implication that the free market isn't so magical, that sometimes markets fail, and sometimes, regardless of how we feel about, quote, big or small government, we need government on some level, not necessarily the federal government, but on some level to intervene. And of course, as you saw in the very first film clip, the fossil fuel industry also plays a role. Because climate change denial may be motivated by its social and political implications, but it's funded and promoted and spread by the fossil fuel industry, who understandably don't want to give up a very profitable product. But it succeeds with the American people because it plays on our belief in free markets, our resistance to big government, our dislike of taxes, our love of freedom, and I should add also American individualism. And those are all reasonable things. So here's the crucial grounds, and it's also, or the crucial point, and it's also going to be the segue into the grounds for hope. I want to argue today that acting on climate doesn't mean we have to have bigger government or higher taxes, that ExxonMobil wants you to think that it does, but they're wrong. So how do we know? Well, think about this. One of the things we discovered in our work, and we wrote about in Merchants of Doubt, was that the same people who were denying the evidence of climate change had also denied the scientific evidence of the harms of tobacco, about acid rain, about the ozone hole. They were what we called serial contrarians, or serial deniers. And in every case, the argument was the same. This is a threat to personal freedom. But and if we fix this, we'll become communists, right? It'll be like the Soviet Union. But in every case, we fixed these problems, and we didn't become communists. So let's just think for a moment about acid rain. The students here are probably too young to remember this, but the faculty aren't. We solved the problem of acid rain through the amendments to the Clean Air Act in 1995 that were signed into law by President George H.W. Bush. So how did we do that? I mean, nobody even talks about acid rain anymore. Well, we implemented an emissions trading system in which utilities could buy and sell permits for sulfur, and over time had to lower the amount of sulfur they were emitting. Now, the really interesting thing about this case, because it happened 20 years ago and we know a lot about it, taxes did not rise. In fact, the price of electricity in the affected regions fell. And I've been to Minnesota and Michigan, and I can tell you that they're just as free as you are here in Utah. Maybe freer, I don't know. Sorry, bad joke. We solved the problem with a sensible law or regulation. Now, admittedly, there was some loss of freedom. Companies, utilities lost the freedom to dump pollution into the atmosphere without being responsible for their actions. I call that accountability. But what about the ozone hole? That's another thing we wrote about in Merchants of Doubt. How did we fix that? Well, we banned the chemicals that caused ozone depletion, the so-called chlorinated fluorocarbons, under an international treaty, the Montreal Protocol to protect stratospheric ozone. Did our taxes rise? Did we lose our freedom? No, we still have refrigerators, we still have air conditioners. We didn't lose the freedom to buy those products. So why not? Why didn't we lose those products? Well, because DuPont, the major manufacturer, was forced by this treaty to find alternatives, which they did, and it turned out those alternatives worked just as well and were no more expensive than the products they replaced. People often say that necessity is the mother of invention. Regulation is a very powerful form of necessity. If you tell the private sector that they need to innovate, they will, and they did. And what about tobacco? We showed in our book that the original merchants of doubt were the tobacco executives who for 40 years denied the scientific evidence of the harms of their product. Indeed, the strategy of selling doubt was partly invented and perfected by the tobacco industry, although now there's some dispute about whether actually the sugar industry deserves that dubious honor, but we'll just say they were one of the early pioneers. So, and many of you have heard this famous quotation from the tobacco industry: doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. The tobacco industry's strategy was to insist that the science was unsettled, to insist that it was up to people to decide for themselves whether or not they wanted to smoke, denying the fact that nicotine is addictive, and to argue that if we let the government decide, it would only be a matter of time before the government would take over our lives. So how did we protect people from this deadly, addictive, and yet legal product? Well, it turns out in this case it's not one answer, but a big part of it was legal action, when ordinary citizens and state attorney generals began to sue the industry for the damages caused by its products. Flight attendants brought attention to the danger of secondhand smoke and sued for lung cancers that had been caused by smoke in aircraft. And this is a great story, too, because there was always this argument about secondhand smoke where people might say that they weren't smokers, but sometimes juries didn't believe them. Sometimes juries would think, well, you say you don't smoke, but, you know, how do we really know? But this case, does anybody know who the lead plaintiff in this case was? It was a woman named Norma Brune, and she was a member of the Mormon Church. And so the jury said, oh, well, you know, she's a saint. She probably really didn't smoke. And of course, the US Department of Justice prosecuted the industry under the RICO Acts, and the industry was found to have committed fraud against the American people. There were other things too, including taxes, that states raised taxes on tobacco products to discourage young people from taking up the habit. So again, we can ask this question: did our taxes rise? Was there a loss of freedom? Well, taxes on cigarettes did rise. So for smokers, the price of smoking did go up. And of course, smokers lost some freedom. Smokers today can't just smoke anywhere they want. They have to smoke mostly in the privacy of their own homes. But there was a huge gain in freedom for the rest of us who didn't smoke, the freedom of the majority of Americans not to be harmed by secondhand smoke. And as for taxation, well, it is true that smokers now pay more for the right to smoke, but the majority of us pay less because we're no longer picking up the huge costs of smoking-related damage. So given this history, we could ask, why should we even believe anything the climate deniers say? And my answer is simply, we shouldn't. Given their history, they really shouldn't be viewed as having any credibility at all. But there's another, even better argument for why we should reject climate change denial, and that's because the solution to climate change already exists, and it doesn't require a bigger government, higher net taxes, or loss of freedom. In fact, if it's done right, it will grow the economy, not the government, and it will increase our options rather than decreasing them. And that's the clean energy revolution, and that's the good news part of this story, which I promised we would get to. So you wouldn't know it watching Fox News or CNN or listening to the oil and gas industry executives insisting that we can't live without fossil fuels, but both in this country and abroad, there is an energy revolution taking place. Many of you know that the cost of solar photovoltaics has fallen dramatically in recent years and is now cost competitive with fossil fuels. In fact, in many places, it's actually cheaper. According to Bloomberg News, solar power is now the cheapest form of new installed energy in 60 countries around the world. Cheaper than coal, cheaper than oil, cheaper than gas, and much cheaper than nuclear. And no surprise then, the capacity is soaring. So this is really good news. We are seeing dramatic gains in solar power across the globe. Wind power capacity is also rising dramatically. In fact, renewables are now half of all new electricity installations around the world. So this is a huge good news story. We are moving in the right direction, no question about it. Moreover, in China, the United States loves to demonize China, blame our problems on them. China just announced a few months ago the cancellation of 104 new coal plants, and they are moving ahead very, very aggressive on solar installations. So this raises an important question for all of us. What is driving this energy revolution? Is it the magic of the marketplace? Maybe the private sector is responding and we actually don't need to do anything. We could just let the private sector do it. Well, the answer is not exactly. So there have been a number of studies looking closely at the question of what has caused this terrific drop in the price of photovoltaic electricity. And one of the best studies that was done by some folks over at MIT concluded that the most important thing were policies that stimulated market growth. In other words, government policies that sent a clear signal to the private sector that this was the way of the future. In other words, it's the market responding to policy incentives. And the most important one, studies show, was the German feed-in tariff. The German government decision to compel utilities in Germany that if somebody generated power using solar power, they would have to buy that power. And we have feed-in tariffs in some places in the United States, notably in Texas, but we don't have it in most states. And also carbon pricing in Europe, which has been a stimulus for the renewable energy economy. Now, going forward, most economists think the single most important thing we can do is to put a price on carbon to make the price of using fossil fuels reflect the true cost. And this, of course, could be done on the federal, the state, or even the local level. And many countries around the globe are now doing this. Around the world, 46 countries either have already or are seriously considering implementing carbon pricing. My time's getting a little short, so I'm going to just skip over this part and just make the point. What this shows is that the technology we need exists. We don't have to invent a new solar technology. It's there. But we need to get the right incentives to stimulate the private sector to adopt it more aggressively. Not convinced? Okay, one more piece of information. So the last 3 years, I've had the opportunity to go to the World Economic Forum in Davos and to mingle with the rich and famous and to eat good food. But the main reason I go is because there's an opportunity to talk to business leaders about energy policy and the way in which policy and technology can work together. And I've had the honor of working with a fantastic group of colleagues at Carnegie Mellon University, a group of computer scientists who have done something really amazing. They have taken gigabytes of data from Landsat imagery, from US Geological Survey, from the US Forest Service, from NOAA, from NASA, and with technical support from Google, created a set of visualizations where you can look at a whole set of different variables related to climate and the environment and economic activity in time-lapse form. The only problem is it takes a lot of computer space. So I don't have the time-lapse version in my PowerPoint, but I have a before and after version. So this is a before and after version to prove to you or to demonstrate the power of policy. So this is a sort of computer simulated image of the United States from space in the year 1984. And any place where there's installed solar PV capacity, so solar electricity, is shown here as a bright dot. And the really weird thing about this graphic is that the only bright dot in the United States is Orlando, Florida. So there must have been something at Disneyland going on, and which I would like to find out about. Maybe it was at Epcot Center. Remember, Epcot was supposed to be the experimental prototype community of the future, so maybe they installed some solar PV a long time ago. But you can see there's essentially no solar power in the United States in 1984, nothing that will show up on this scale. Now we fast forward to 2015. And look at this, very interesting. Almost all of California is lit up, and a huge part of the Northeast, the Atlantic states. Now, if we were to think that solar power would be developed first in the places that are sunniest, we would expect to see this big growth in California, which we do see. But we would also expect a lot of growth in the Four Corners state, Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, Colorado. But actually, you see, there's not that much. And we wouldn't necessarily expect a lot in Massachusetts or New York or New Jersey, which frankly are not very sunny places. But yet, look, tremendous growth of solar power in the Northeast. And look even more closely. If you look there, or on my next slide, oh, sorry. I don't have a pointer, but I thought I had an enlargement of this, but looks like you don't. There's a kind of funny little rectangle that's not so bright there. So I'm sorry, I made a mistake here. So what I want to say is that, so these states, the ones that are all lit up, are all states that implemented strong policies to support renewable energy. So for example, in California, AB 32, which is an emission trading system. In Massachusetts, we have RGGI, which I forget what it stands for, but it's a tax credit for solar power. New Jersey, New York, these are all states that implemented policies to support, usually through tax credits, renewable energy installation. Sorry, okay, here's my close-up. But if you look closely here now, you see this weird kind of dark spot right here? That's Rhode Island. I mean, now, I have nothing against Rhode Island. I have a lot of friends in Rhode Island. That's the power of policy. While Massachusetts and Connecticut were passing laws to support renewable energy, Rhode Island didn't. And look at this. I mean, this is kind of amazing. The same kind of people live in Rhode Island as Massachusetts and Connecticut. The politics are not very different. The education levels are not very different. The income levels are not very different. The accent isn't even very different. But there's almost no solar power there. Technology, same technology is available. Now this will change because actually just this year, Rhode Island did pass a renewable portfolio standard. They're mostly going with wind, so next year I'm hoping to get some data on wind power installations. So this will change going forward, but that is proof of the power of policy. Same country, same people, same technology, different outcome. Okay, so. And all this renewable energy doesn't just light up homes, it also creates jobs. So we've heard a lot in the last year about the coal industry and about coal miners who are losing their jobs, and that's a real thing. And for those people, it's non-trivial. But it's really important for us to recognize that actually there aren't very many jobs in the coal industry, haven't been for a long time. Today in the United States, there are about 65,000 jobs in the coal industry. There are about 195,000 in oil and gas. So how many jobs are there in clean energy, if by that we mean both renewables and energy efficiency? Well, it's hard to get good data on this. I checked a lot of different reports. There are big variations in the estimates, and some of this has to do with how you define a job in energy efficiency. But the estimates from the US Department of Labor and other reliable sources, something between 769,000 and 3.5 million. So even if we take the low end, that's 3 times the jobs in fossil fuels. And these jobs are in every state. In fact, there are more in red states than in blue states, and it's one of the fastest growing sectors of the US economy. It had 13% growth in 2015. That's huge. Solar now exceeds all jobs in oil and gas or coal. Just for comparison, the automobile industry employs about 7 million people. Auto dealers are about 1.65. So if we take a middle level of those estimates, there are now as many jobs in solar and renewable energy as there are auto dealers. So this is a huge story, and yet it's hardly being covered by the press. In an economy where growth overall is sluggish, renewable energy growth is strong and outpacing many other sectors. So the take home is that there is real, substantial, solid good news here. The technology we need to fix this problem largely exists, and it creates good jobs that can't easily be outsourced. But there is still one serious problem. We're not implementing it fast enough. And we know from the science that this is a time-sensitive issue. So to accelerate the great energy transition, we need the right policies, policies that support the renewable industry and discourage fossil fuel production and consumption. And this is the main reason why economists argue for carbon pricing to create a better incentive structure. But it doesn't have to be carbon pricing. There are a variety of different things that can be done, as we saw in Germany with the feed-in tariff. There are many different policy options to support the growth of a renewable sector. Technology alone doesn't solve the problem because for now, fossil fuels still remain cheaper in many places, particularly for automobiles, and sometimes a lot cheaper. And this is primarily because of subsidies. So I'm going to skip this because I think people here know this, and we don't need to kind of belabor that point. So the take-home message is To solve the climate and energy problem, we need technology and policy. We don't need bigger government, but we do need different government, different policies. Policies that help us create the future we want for ourselves and for all the other humans and creatures with which we share the gifts of creation. Because what I always want to argue, and to end on a positive note, fighting climate change isn't about protecting the planet. It's about protecting us and all the things we love. Thank you very much. I have to apologize, that's not Utah. I was trying to find a good photograph I had of myself in Utah. It's actually Switzerland, but, you know.
So we do have a bit of time for questions, and Professor Oreskes was happy to take some questions. So,
thanks, Naomi. Kevin Lee Caster from Salt Lake City. I'm just curious, have you ever looked into how much it would cost for us to hire the Merchants of Doubt? And
yeah, a lot more than we can afford. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this is part of the problem, right? It's such not a level playing field. And sometimes I'll hear people say, oh, well, environmentalists do the same things, you know. But I don't think that's true. Actually, I don't think environmentalists have to lie, because I think the science is actually on the side of sustainability. But even if they did, I mean, the playing field's not even remotely close. And there are people, Robert Brule at Drexel has been trying to actually figure out how much money these people have spent. It's very hard to find out, because all of this is behind closed doors. But I think it's a very plausible estimate that many hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on climate change disinformation. And if you include lobbying, anti-environmental lobbying, it's probably in the, you know, over $1 billion. Yeah, well, yeah, Robert Brule actually has a paper on this coming out that I can't talk about because it hasn't been published yet. But I think, you know, he's got some pretty compelling statistics showing that environmental lobbying, you know, it's not even remotely close to the amount of money spent on oil and gas lobbying.
Other questions, Dave?
Thank you. You focused on fossil fuels as a contributor to our current decline in our climate and that sort of thing. Can you speak to industrial animal agriculture and its impact? Yeah, I understand it's quite significant.
It is. Thank you for that question. And you know, it's interesting because there's the climate change problem, the greenhouse gas problem, in a way really has two components. One is greenhouse gases from fossil fuels associated with transportation, industry, electricity, all that. And the other is sort of what you could call the biological side, deforestation and agriculture. And it's about 60-40. 60% is the physical, what I call the physical science side, and the 40% is on the biological side. So as a physical scientist, I got into this issue from the physical science side, and also because the Merchants of Doubt represent, in a sense, the fossil fuel side. They're mostly coming out of the fossil fuel industry. We haven't really seen the agriculture industry play the same kind of role, maybe because people, environmentalists, until pretty recently hadn't focused that much on the food and deforestation side of things. But you're absolutely right. It's about 40% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So it's very significant. And ultimately, if we want to address this problem, we have to address both.
Thank you.
Is there good scientific data of how much CO2 in the atmosphere is contributed to by volcanoes?
Oh, yes, there is. I don't have that in this particular slide because I used to have to answer that question a lot more than I do these days. We do know that volcanoes contribute some CO2 in the atmosphere. We know that the baseline CO2 at the original level, which was about 280 before industrialization, that was volcanic. But we also know that probably something like 90% of the additional CO2 in the atmosphere has come from human activities. And the reason for that is simple. Volcanoes haven't really changed, right? There's no physical driving force to make volcanic activity greater now than it was in the 19th century or the 15th century or 1 million years ago. And as a geologist, this is something that I studied before I became a historian of science. So there have always been volcanoes. There still are volcanoes. They do put a little bit of CO2 into the atmosphere. And we know how much CO2 comes from volcanoes because we can measure it isotopically. Because the carbon that comes out of volcanoes has a different carbon isotope signature than the carbon that comes out of fossil fuels and also deforestation. And this work has been done, it was done a long time ago, and we know that the isotopic signature of the incremental CO2 is almost entirely plant-based, fossil fuels and deforestation.
Doesn't sound like it's on that one. Hang on.
So you've talked a lot about, as far as from a business end and a politics end, and what we need to change there. Can you kind of briefly speak on as far as individual culture and behavior from the general population?
Mm-hmm. Sure, definitely. So the question is about individual behavior and culture. So I think it's a really important question. I think it's very important for individuals to do what they can do, because if you don't, you feel disempowered. And also if you don't, then people can use that as an excuse to say, well, Joe's not doing anything, so why should I do anything? But at the same time, I often say I can change my light bulbs, but I can't change my electricity grid. So it's a both-end problem. So on the personal front, there's a lot you can do. My house, we installed solar PV about 5 years ago when we moved to Boston, to the Boston area. Our electricity is now just about 100% PV solar. And one of the things I always like to say to people, you know, the merchants of doom and gloom, which I consider the fossil fuel industry, because I think we actually have the positive story on our side, they want to say you're going to freeze in the dark if you don't have fossil fuels. But I can tell you, when I flip on my light switch, my solar electricity is the same as the electricity I had before. Like, I don't notice a difference, right? I've also installed LED lights in all the rooms of my house, and those are better. LED lights are fantastic. And if people come to my house, I'm like kind of an evangelist for LED lights. I make people touch my LEDs because there's no heat. And at first people are afraid. They're like scared to touch them because we all have this association with light bulbs being really hot, but they're not hot. And then you touch them and you suddenly realize, like, the light bulb goes off. All that heat is waste. That is energy inefficiency. That is waste heat. And think about summertime. If you're air conditioning your house, and now you've got all this waste heat, but if you don't add all this waste heat to your house, then it's a double savings because you also don't have to air condition so much in summer. And of course you save money because energy efficiency saves you money. So LEDs are a giant thing, and the price of LEDs has fallen dramatically in the last couple of years. They're hardly more expensive than compact fluorescents now. So LEDs, if you're a homeowner putting in your own solar PV, or even if you're not, you can do one of these contracts. Like, do you have SolarCity here in Utah? Or you have some equivalent?
We do. We have some versions of that, and yeah.
And then, of course, there's things like electric cars. You know, one of the things that's interesting about electric cars is a lot of people think it's not worth buying an electric car unless your electricity is renewable. But my fantastic, amazing postdoc, Jeffrey Supran, did an analysis of this before he came to work with me at Harvard, in which they looked at the energy efficiencies of electric vehicles. And it turns out electric vehicles are so energy efficient compared to internal combustion engines that even if your electricity is coming from coal, it's still better to drive an electric car. So who knew that, right? So, you know, and it's not worth rushing out and buying a new car if your old one is still good, because there's a lot of energy associated with manufacturing new cars. But if you're in the market for a new car, it's time to buy an electric one. So right now I'm driving a 1997 BMW Z3. I'm going to drive that car till it dies, but then I'll buy an electric car.
Newer cars have even less emissions on them, even if it's not electric.
Right.
But
and my BMW is going to die soon driving in Massachusetts, so, you know.
I think we better end there, so we have time for Naomi to do some book signing out in the Echo Expo area, and you've got some time before sessions start. It may be, I may ask people in the next session, maybe let's start at 4:05, just so we have a titch more time for you to look about, get books signed if you're interested. But please, let's thank Professor Oreskes